Welcome to the Evolutionary Women's Podcast. I'm your host, Jeannie Manchester. Join me in this sacred space for exploring the journey of spiritual awakening in the everyday and the ordinary. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any of our new releases. So let's go ahead and dive into today's episode. Hey everyone, this is Jeannie Manchester. I am your host of the Evolutionary Women's Podcast, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about this wonderful interview that I had with my dear, dear friend and teacher, Dr. Douglas Brooks. So Douglas Brooks is a high scholar of Hinduism, South Asian languages, and comparative study of religions. He lived in India for many years with his teacher, Appa, Gopala Aiyar Sundaramoorthy, which we affectionately call Appa. I had the great opportunity to travel to India with Douglas many years ago and to be in Appa's house. Douglas was with Appa for many years studying and practicing the Śrīvidyā, Auspicious Wisdom of the High Tantra, the goddess-centered Tantra. So currently, and he has been for many years, a professor of religion at the University of Rochester, where he holds both master's and his doctoral degrees from Harvard University. Douglas has been one of those voices that I have really gone to for understanding the goddess traditions. And so I asked him to come on the podcast, one of the few male teachers that I've asked to come on, to really give us his understanding of how we got from the Indus Valley civilization of the earth-based goddess traditions to the Tantras and passing through the Vedic era where many of these goddesses made it through and many did not. And we discuss that evolution from the pre-Indus Valley civilization all the way through to what we would call modern day Hinduism. So it's very interesting to hear Douglas talk about this, as well as diving deep. He weaves this so seamlessly into the divine feminine, powerful figure of the Mahabharata, the great epic tale of Draupadi, who is, the wife of the Pandavas, the good guys in the Gita and the Mahabharata. And she is this divine feminine character, and you just have to listen in to hear about the strength and character of Draupadi and her 5 husbands, and how she is lost really in this dice game when her husbands fail to protect her. So she questions the very foundation of her honor, their honor, and she has to consult with Krishna in the Mahabharata. So please listen in. We learned so much from Douglas. We're so grateful to have him on this podcast. And I think those of you that have that longing to understand how we go from this early earth-based goddess tradition and how that moves forward into the Vedic period and into eventually the Tantric era, there's none other than this beautiful voice of Douglas Brooks to really take in this wisdom. So I hope you enjoy the podcast. So Douglas, can you help me understand this idea of when Hinduism came into history, I guess you would say, in relationship to Shaktism?
Sure. So the first thing I think we really need to appreciate is to take the words and the categories that we're using historically and try to understand them as descriptive and explanatory terms, things we can use to help us understand a body of phenomena. And we're the inventors of that classification, right? So there's a famous old trope that was offered up by the great Agayananda Bharati. Bharati, I don't know if you know who he was. He wrote the Tantra tradition, and he wrote an autobiography of himself called The Ochre Robe. And Bharati in the 1950s wandered into India. He was an Austrian aristocrat and born into, and with a deep interest in language and music and philosophy. And anyway, he became a sannyasi. He became a renunciate in India. And then in the 1950s, so way before the Beat Generation, before the East comes West, before the 60s movement. And Bharati was an exceptionally gifted scholar, a wonderfully eccentric and difficult character, but kind of emblematic of the problem. Anyway, Bharati called Hinduism the pizza effect. Um, and and what he meant was, and I really appreciate this because it's personal to me, pizza was invented like on the Lower East Side by its Southern Italian immigrants in New Jersey and Lower Manhattan, somewhere at the beginning of whenever knows, right? And then it was re-imported back into Italy. Now you go to Rome and there's pizza on every corner, right? So Hinduism is a category invented elsewhere and then adopted by Hindus. Now, not all Hindus want to call what they do Hinduism, and then they get all wound up in whether Hinduism is a religion. That's usually about how nervous they are about the word religion. Oh, Hinduism is a way of life, to which I would say, well, that's because you're nervous about the word religion, or you're not quite sure how to put this puzzle together. But it's a category that was invented by others, whether they were scholars or other people, to describe a body of people and phenomena and locations and worlds. The word Hindu has to do with, the first usages have to do with those who lived east of the Sindhu River. It's a Persian designation. But for whatever purposes and in whatever ways the word comes to sort of talk about people or a land or a body of phenomena or a religion, it's also a word that's been adopted by Hindus, right, who call themselves Hindus. And we can trace the history of that, and that itself is a topic, and that's actually pretty well documented. So if folks are interested in kind of tracking down the history of the terms and the nomenclature, scholarship's done a good job of that, I think. But let's make this clearer and simpler and kind of get down to roots of it all. The better way to think of it is that Hinduism is the emergent body of information and phenomena and conversation and culture and peoples who represent the amalgam of an immigration culture meeting meeting itself in a pre-existent world of cares and concerns that were the subcontinent. Let me make that simpler because that was way too convoluted. The people who spoke the Vedic language and brought the oldest literary poetry we have to India. They brought it to India, right? They were immigrants. This is beyond dispute, no matter what contemporary politics might want to say about it. The origins of the Veda are not in India. They are from the migrant people who bring their culture to India when, somewhere around 1800 before the Christian era, the Rig Veda becomes their lasting, enduring, oldest body of poetry. They do meet peoples there and talk about them, even in the Veda. There are peoples in indigenous subcontinental India, particularly people who speak the Dravidian language Tamil, who have culture and poetry as old as the Veda. The Sangam poetry of the Tamils is exquisitely beautiful, sophisticated, and as ancient as the Veda. But when the Vedic people come, their first encounters and relationships have to do with the religions and values of their ancestors. And those ancestors were principally interested in a vertical communication. They were gods of the sky and working through ritual transmissions to empower themselves and create relationships of value and much less virtue than power, but creating relationships of empowerment in a world in which you transacted offerings and gifts for the sake of mutual advantage and gain. Vedic people are the easiest way to think of them as people of the sky, because their ancestors looked up to find out where they were, right? And the word for happiness is sukha, and the word for sorrow or things amiss or suffering is dukkha, right? So what's the kaha? Well, the kaha is the old Vedic word for the vault of the sky. right? So sukha, good sky, dukkha, bad sky. Why? Because their ancestors, if they didn't invent the wheel, they gave us all the words for it. If they didn't give us the word vehicle, they gave us the word vahana. Every Hindu god has a vahana. Ganesha's got a mouse, Shiva's got a bull. Those are their literally their vehicles. Those folks ancestrally came from the West, probably rather ironically and sadly from Eastern Ukraine, and much disputed today, of course. And when they arrived, they spoke this Indic language. They brought their Indic gods, and their tradition was one of ritual offering. We usually will use the word sacrifice, but I want to think of that word as making things sacred rather than giving up to get. Although there's plenty of giving up to get because that's how getting and giving is done. That notwithstanding, they meet people and integrate and assimilate and develop worlds where those people were much more encoded into the earth rather than into the sky. And those peoples of the earth were foundationally grounded, kind of literally, there now I'm punning, in an agrarian and pastoral society centered on the goddess. The goddess of the earth meets the goddesses of the earth. The sublime feminine meets the people of the sky. And there's a very famous Vedic hymn about sky marrying earth, the marriage of heaven and earth. And in a certain way, that is a description of the evolution of Hinduism. Because they do assimilate and commingle and create something that isn't much like what we would call Vedism or Brahmanism. Now we can talk about those categories also, but those are the precedents. Like that's what comes before we come to the Hindus. When we come to the Hindus, we are describing a historical complexity of people and culture and values and ideas and practices in which the sacred undertakes this dramatic and significant assimilation and commingling and development, in which principles of masculine, feminine, and commingled, even non-binary categories all collect around relationships to the sacred. That's going to give us a pantheon of gods, some of whom have old names that go back to the Veda. Most of the gods of the Veda, in the clearest sense, are not really terribly important gods of the Hindus. So to give you a simple example, there are 300 hymns to the chieftain and king of the gods, Indra, among the 1,028 hymns of the Rig Veda. There's a whole book, 9, devoted to the elixir god Soma, who inspires and gets you high and does all those things to illuminate heart and mind. Neither of those characters are particularly important in what we would call Hinduism. Rudra, for whom there are only 3 hymns directly and maybe 6 where he's dealing with other kinds of characters, Maruts, Ashwins, other kinds of names and important characters who are all over the Veda. Rudra is going to evolve into the yogi Shiva. And by 1,000 or so before the Christian era, that development of Rudra, who's a sky god, who's pretty sort of irascible, dangerous. Well, he's furious. He's Rudra. He's Ravana, right? Becomes Shiva, auspicious. Now he's no less irascible, dangerous, and God with attitude. Let's put it that way. I mean, in the Veda, the hymns to Rudra are, Rudra, you are our last resort. You're the only one who can solve this. And when you come, please don't destroy us in your wake. Like he's a complexity of, and it's not a moral issue. And that's important too. Like as we move from Vedism to Hinduism, one of the great continuities is that these traditions, and now we're getting to the Shaktas because that's what you asked about. These are traditions that see the universe as power. It's not created for good. It's not invested in a fall or an evil. It's a world of power. And in a world of power, information contends with information. Power, desire, interest, advantage, success, right? That is every feature of the world that gathers around it that gathers around power a relationship to desire. And then desire becomes interest. Like, well, what is my desire? And how do I meet my desires? And how are my desires met? Because I have advantage, because you can't meet your desires unless you have advantage with, advantage over, advantage with respect to the world around you. Power, desire, interest, advantage, success. That model persists. To see the world as power is to see that conversation evolves to return to a fundamental claim. So this ancient Indian world, that becomes a subcontinental world, is a world rooted in power. The word for power is Shakti. The word for power, and those who embrace the power and who revere the power and who fear the power and who plead with the power and who engage the power as a source of empowerment and with respect for the risk and dangers and conflicts and challenges that involve cooperation with power, those are called Shaktas. Shakti and Shakta is encoded. I don't want to, because I think gender comes later as a category. It is encoded feminine. Why is power over-encoded feminine? That's an interesting kind of question to ask. Because again, in these languages, the language themselves, like Vedic into Sanskrit, those Indo-European languages of those sorts all have number, gender, and case. That's part of their linguistic characterization. They have masculine, feminine, and neuter encoded language. And that's just part of their structural inheritance. That's how they work. And so why is the world of power encoded a world feminine? And I think that, again, takes us to elemental ideas of what power is in a human life. I mean, power is living, right? And living is moving, it's breathing, it's dynamic, it's being born, it's being created, it's being sustained, it's being reabsorbed. Power is withheld and power is offered. It is concealed and revealed. So when you get to later important categories like creation, persistence, dissolution, concealment, and grace, like the famous 5 Shaktis that are described in Shaivism and in Shaktism and in the Tantra, you're describing a relationship that human beings have with their embodiment, with the natural world, and with culture, because those all involve creativity, persistence, change, dissolution, and they involve what is being offered, grace, and what is being withheld, boundaries. And so you're looking at fundamental categories of how human beings experience reality and self-organize themselves as individuals, as members of tribe and culture, as players in a natural world, and in a conversation of the cosmos in which we are both empowered and endangered and victimized by energies and forces that we can harbor and engage, but we can't entirely control. Now we have a feminine goddess or a feminine sublime who we don't control, and who because we don't control the terms and conditions of our existence, but who gave us, but in some sense, an ancient Indian world says, but all of this was a gift. Like all of this was a birthing. All of this was a nurturing. All of this is a process of change and reassimilation. All of this is grace and boundary. And in all of those ways, it encodes mother, it encodes sister, it encodes lover, it encodes friend, it encodes an intimacy with power. That's Shaktism.
Wow. That was a download.
Sorry.
Douglas. So when we
So let me just say one more. Can I rant a little more? So Shaktism then becomes a category that, in an interesting way, especially religiously and spiritually and historically in yoga, is one that doesn't feature itself, but features relationship. So I think it's fair to say that Hindu traditions, as we understand them to now, essentially pour into three categories. Vishnu-centered, Vaishnava, Shaiva-centered, Shaivite, and then what I would call the great expanse of the deities, who are usually local and very distinctive. But all of those kind of divisions of the Hindu world, all of them have a Shakta element. In a more technical sense, like when you study the history of the Tantras, Shaktism is really featured within Shaivite worlds. So it's Shiva Shakti. That's the obvious consideration. Although there are tantric goddess traditions of Vaishnava worlds, where Radha Krishna worlds, other Vaishnava-centered goddess traditions, but they're not predominant. But Shaktism itself is built on complex relationships with nature, culture, and conscience, with all of these forms. And then philosophically and ritually and in other ways, it evolves in its own kind of distinctive parameters. Like it evolves into groups and sects and different kinds of initiation, beliefs and practices, like in siddhantas and upasanas, like things that people thought and things that people did, like and in those ways, the Shaktas will end up having their own distinctive views. So there are all kinds of interesting Shakta philosophical arguments that take on the Shaivites, that take on the Vaishnavas. So they become their own kind of sectarian re-representation. But even in that sense, you're in oceanic waters. And the best way to understand that is to localize them. So we can talk about Shaktism, but who do you mean? And what are you really talking about? You're going to have to kind of drop a pin. You're going to have to drop a pin in a place, in history, among people, in a temple, in a village, somewhere. You're going to have to go from the idea of power is the universe, the power is feminine, let's call that the goddess, and that the goddess, but who the goddess is and how she represents to people depends on who you ask and when you ask. Mm-hmm. And so Hinduism is do you remember Tip O'Neill? He was the Speaker of the House for about 30 years. He was from Massachusetts, and he cut a deal with Ronald Reagan when Reagan was elected. And O'Neill was very famous for saying all politics is local. So even on the national scale, even on the most universal scale, it's really about your constituents. Like it's about the people at home. That's the way to think about Shaktism. Yeah. Like Shaktism is a phenomenon. It's all over and saturates the ethos of India, because when those Vedic people arrived, 1800 before the Christian era, they arrived to a world where the people preceding them, immediately preceding them, especially in the Indus Valley, from Harappa to Mohenjo-daro to almost 10,000 square miles, were certainly goddess-centered people. And of course, I think that has everything to do with water, with agriculture, with how you live and die, how you subsist and flourish. Those are all questions. Now, very interestingly, that Indus Valley civilization flourished and then failed. And we know it failed catastrophically. That's another story. It probably failed catastrophically because of the very thing that sustained them and kept them, which was water. They probably died that civilization was probably wiped out in a very short time by catastrophic weather, which ironically reappeared about 30 years ago. And that's one of the reasons we think. But they certainly didn't die of invasion. They didn't die from the Vedic people who came to conquer them. There's no evidence of that. None, in fact. And they did, and they didn't. And they didn't die so if they didn't die of invasion and they didn't die of starvation and self-subsisting, like what got them? Well, these Indus Valley people, the mother reassumed them. Like the one who fed them and nourished them took them back, except in a fury of the weather. There's no doubt about that. At least there doesn't seem to be. Anyway, these.
And in this tradition, then we see that thread all the way to
Right. That thread is integral to the foundation that becomes Hinduism. Because again, the gods of the Veda, I mean, there are Vedic goddesses, and by the later forms of the Veda, we're starting to get Vach, and we get the Devi Sukta, we get the goddess of speech, and we get Devi Sukta, a hymn to the goddess. These are appendages to the older parts of the Veda. There is the dawn, Ushas, there's Ratri, the night, there's the river Sarasvati. But truth to tell, they're not terribly important in the Veda. Not when 300 hymns go to Indra, and Rudra is really the greatest legacy of that Vedic world. When we finally get the emergence of Mahadevi, the great goddess, that phenomena is because of the great assimilation that happens when the people of the sky, the Vedic people, met the people of the earth. Now, the earliest forms of goddess mythologies and goddess-centered storytelling, again, we can look for it. You have to say, well, where would we find that? Like, how would we know that, right? And the answer would be in language and in archaeology. So in archaeology, we have plenty of evidence, but statues aren't people. So it's hard to say where they came from and where they didn't. The linguistic evidence is very telling. We get the first compilation of goddess mythologies somewhere around the 4th century of our era. And that happens in a text that you're very familiar with, probably many folks who might be listening. That's the Devi Mahatmya. It's also called the Durga Saptashati. That is the 700 verses to Durga. That text never really adds up to 700. So it just means like a lot, somewhere around 700 verses. But that text is very much, or Devi Mahatmya, the crystallization or the great effulgent identity of the goddess, Mahatmya, what we want to mean by that. Those Durga myths and Kali myths and the transition between Durga and Kali, and some of those stories that you're very familiar with that you can tell easily on any given day, Blood Seed, Raktabija, Mahishashura, the water buffalo demon, Shumba and Nishumba, the twin demons. These are compiled in the Devi Mahatmya somewhere between the 4th and the 6th century in the Sanskrit language, in a familiar kind of Sanskrit of the era, crystallized Sanskrit, but those are probably much older stories because they're already very sophisticated. So now we have to say, well, what's the relationship between orality and access we have to historical language or written texts, which is even a further complication because most of these texts were not written down for centuries before they already had crystallized in memory. Remember, India is a memory culture. We live in a writing culture, the way the Chinese lived in a writing culture. We live in a culture where if it's not written, it's not real. Now, what's real nowadays is a whole nother story because of virtual and AI and everything else. Like that's always been a contention. But think of it this way: ancient China, like the Western world, at least since Charlemagne, like since the Bible went to Jerome to Latin, right, has been fundamentally a written culture. The book is called the Bible, right? Which suggests writing and the media and the process of gathering and remembering and collecting that information as having an authority in the word we use. We use the word scripture, which means writing, right? That's why when people talk about the Indian scriptures, like my whole being kind of twists serpentine sideways, because the Veda is memorized and repeated syllable by syllable for the better part of 1,000 years before we have any evidence of it ever being written down, right? And we have all kinds of attestation of this prodigious pachydermian memory of Indian culture. So when we get to the goddess traditions, much of which are coming from non-Vedic sources in their origins, and lots of Dravidian sources, South Indian sources, those Southern people, Tamil people, are again working in an autochthonous, a native language of the native languages of the subcontinent that are not related to Vedic or Sanskrit by origin, right? This is very old stuff. Those folks have been there since well before the Ice Age. People in South India have been there 65,000 years as far as we know. You know, Tamils are genetically related to Australian Aboriginals and people in Papua New Guinea. Like these folks have been there a long, long time, and they have been undoubtedly telling stories of their goddess since they've been humans. Like since the subcontinent was no longer the Horn of Africa, like since ever. What crystallizes in attested historical material, that's a vast distance from their origins. So by the time we get to Devi Mahatmya, 4th, 6th century of our era, which may seem like a long time ago to us, these folks have probably been telling these stories for not just generations, but well past any kind of generational memory, which again kind of takes us to the notion of how archetypal the goddess is to India. Like she's not a phenomenon. She's not a thing. She's the sensibility of that world connected to life, to power. And the symbols of that, water, the famous tanks that collect water and blood and milk, and the liquidities and flow and movement and the dynamism of the goddess is archetypally present as features of who these people are, as long as we can remember that they were people at all, right? I mean, the oldest Hindu temples always have a tank either adjacent or inside the temple. In almost every case, the tank is older than the structures around them by a long shot. Why? Because water is life. And water collected is civilization. And water collected for what purpose? Well, for every purpose. I mean, if you've been to India, right, you find out that people bathe in the temple tank, they cook water in the temple tank, they take a shit in the temple tank, they do everything in the temple tank, right? Because she's everything. She's that source of life and death and sustenance. She's also the source of disease. I mean, there are smallpox goddesses. There's all kinds of appeal to goddesses who prevent smallpox, give you smallpox, give you some kind of like, Lord knows, you know, when the palace, the body, you know this because of yoga, the body is called the Palace of Nine Gates. And anybody who's lived in India long enough has seen all 9 gates open at the same time. All you have to do is drink the water. So, you know, she created you, she sustains you, and she kills you. She ferociously protects you, and she will consume you. Why? Because she is life itself. And again, the place to find Shaktism first isn't in texts or in storytelling or even in the archaeology. It's in the archetypes. Look at how these very real phenomena of human life, water, rain, blood, milk, semen, the transmission of fluids, the fluid dynamics of human life it's in those archetypes encoded feminine. Because why? Because they birth you, they sustain you, They reclaim you. They offer the gift and they offer the challenge. They create, they envelop us and they bind us. They give us boundary and distinction. They give us meaning. When you look at the most ancient Indian worlds, look for those things. Look for the archetypal symbols. You want to follow the feminine in India? Follow the water tanks, follow the rivers, follow the hair. Draupadi's hair is a fascinating feature of her mythology. Draupadi's follow the blood. Blood is the most exquisitely thoroughgoing encoding of identity in India because it works triadically. A woman's life is before the blood, the cycles of blood, and the reabsorption of blood. Those are formal categories in mythologies and philosophies. Those are categories of power, right? So we get virgin goddesses, young goddesses, princess goddesses. Why? Because they are incipient power, they're incipient fertility, they're incipient change, and they're powerful. And then when we get to Sumangali, the second category of the mature woman who's cycling through blood, well, she represents both birth and danger. If her menstrual cycles don't happen, there's no life. If her menstrual cycles fall too far out of rhythm, she hemorrhages and dies. It's a world built on change and movement and life and danger and birth and creativity and death. And all of those things coincide with these archetypal symbols. None is more important than blood. That's why blood features so importantly in the Draupadi myths. Let's just do a little bit of that just to show you exactly how that works out. So fast forward into the Draupadi myth, where we find out that this heroine, who is distinctive in the feature of her polyandry, which has also drawn huge attention, right? Draupadi is the wife of 5 husbands. So that's a lot of girl. And because those Pandavas are formidable. Now we can see the 5 Pandava brothers who are married to Draupadi, Yudhishthira, Bhimasena, Arjuna, Nakula, and Sahadev, the twins. We can see them almost as a single organism. They're distinctive and individual, but they also kind of function like a colony. Does that make sense? They're as much like ants as they, not in a bad sense, but in the sense of being a collective organism as they are in their distinctive identities. And that distinctiveness and collectiveness is the first feature of Draupadi's character. Because as you follow her relationship with the Pandavas all the way through the story, she knows each one of them. She knows what they like to eat. She knows how they're likely to respond. She prefers sex with some and not with others. She's got a lot to contend with, and her ability to sort the world and to see and to understand where things go and how space is organized in substance and in movement and in relationship and in change is embodied in her heroine character. Better than any other heroine in the storytelling tradition, precisely because she has 5 husbands, and each one of them has a personality, has tastes, has distinctions, even if they all function in some sense as a harmonic collective. Because one of the other features of the Pandava, and it's important to understanding Draupadi also, is that they're not much in contention with each other. They're not rivals. They're not vying for power. There's no sibling rivalry among Pandava. It's not how it works. But, and it's a big love problem. Like, she has this sort of priestly, austere, thoughtful, philosophical Yudhishthira one night, and then she's got the wolf belly, hairy guy with a club, Bhima, the next. Like, good on her, because that's a lot to contend with. But at a crucial moment, here let's follow the blood story. At a crucial moment, much later on in the story, in the famous dicing game of the Mahabharata, too much to explain here. But the Pandavas end up having to play dice with their arch rival nihilist cousins, the Kauravas. And the secret of the dice game isn't told in the dice game, but I'll blow it for you here if you want to know. The secret of the dice game is that Yudhishthira, the Pandava king, must lose the dice game, because the dice game is emblematic of sovereign power, literally giving itself back to the world. So the dice game is played at the conclusion of a royal consecration in which Yudhishthira is going to be anointed, Abhishekam, is going to be anointed the king of kings. His job at the end of that is that he has received the loyalty, the wealth, and the self-subjugation of all of the princes to his power. His job is to play dice with those princes at the end of their self-subjugation and give it all back to them. To lose the game is to give them face and to take the power of sovereignty and hand it back to his allies, to his friends, even to his cousins. The problem is the Kaurava, the villains of our story, play the dice game for reals. So they not only want Yudhishthira to lose, and no one knows that he's going to lose, except Yudhishthira. Yudhishthira knows that he's going to lose the game because he's made a point of not becoming good at dice. But he's also, because he wants to lose honestly, this is how strange the story can be, but it's also because he knows he must lose in order to win. Because you don't conquer people, you gain their trust and alliance. And so while the game is a game, it's a facade and a ruse to make sure that everybody ends up prosperous. He loses everything. Let's fast forward in the game. Near the end of the game, he loses himself, and then he loses Draupadi, and he loses his brothers. At which point, the villains of our story, Duryodhana, and Duryodhana has a brother who's a kind of henchman brother named Dushasana. Dushasana, so, and three characters named Krishna are all missing from the dice game scene, because there are three important Krishnas in the Bhagavad Gita. There's Krishna Dvaipanayana, that's Vyasa, the sage. He's not there. If he were there, his authority would have changed, and his authority would have changed the character of the game. The second Krishna that isn't there is the Krishna we think of as Krishna, Vasudeva, that is Lord Krishna. He's out doing something else. That's an interesting digression, why he's not there, but he's not there. Let's just leave it at that. The third Krishna of the dice game is called Krishna. That's Draupadi. Now, Krishna, or Krishna, means dark, and it means the midnight sky. So all of the three Krishnas stand for some kind of foundational shadow, as if she's the darkness of the sky, like Kali is, and the lights are breaking through her, and she envelops them. It's kind of a feminine penetration theory, like that the masculine emerges out of the feminine. But she's the kind of large tapestry. She's the armature on which the entire plot is built. Dushasana, and she's not at the dice game. Why is she not in the dice game? Go back to the archetype of power. She is in her menses. She's in the first 3 days of her menses. Now, until very recently, the custom of women partially secluding themselves during the first 3 days of their menses was a common custom among Brahmins, even in South India. Like when I lived in my teacher's house in the 70s, every girl in the house did this. When they came of age, as soon as they entered their period, the first 3 days, and it didn't matter how long their period lasted, they were there's a whole vocabulary for it in Tamil, but they were out. Like they didn't have to go to school. They didn't serve themselves. They didn't clean the house. They didn't do anything. They had no chores. They had no tasks. Some of them hated it. Some of them saw it as a vacation. Some of them felt it oppressive and horrible. Sometimes they liked it. It's the complexity. It's a cultural custom with fair degrees of oppression and respect kind of strangely commingled. It's both abusive and strangely acknowledging power, because if she's bleeding, she's powerful. So, and one of the characteristics of being in the menses is that women won't wash their hair. And the end of the 3-day period is marked by washing your hair. Because hair is power, and how you wear your hair in India, and especially a heroine like Draupadi, signifies power. So when, let's go back to that, because let's follow the hair and the blood. When they're little girls, when a girl gets her first long braid, like, the tradition of Indian women wearing one long braid, this is deep. This cuts archetypally, because hair signifies power and binding and self-binding, right? So when she's a little girl, her mother ties her hair, right? And that signifies, in some sense, her protection and her belonging. She's bound up. She's mine, right? When she's Sumangali, her hair is only taken down 2 times. When she's in her menses, because she would be inaccessible, and when you're having sex, because it's a display. It's a letting go. It's a revelation of vulnerability and of beauty. So during the menses, she doesn't wash her hair. She finishes the menses by washing her hair and reties her own hair, or has one of her sisters or some other woman in the house tie her hair, right? When she's a widow, she may shave her head, right? There goes the hair, because the hair has to do with auspiciousness and power. Now we're on 2 different categories. So think of blood as power and hair as auspiciousness. Now let's make the distinction, right? Power is ubiquitous and needs organization. Auspiciousness is the goddess's principle of organization. What does auspicious mean? Auspicious means the capacity to create affirmation and the capacity to not only affirm and say yes. The goddess says yes to everything. Like, start there. She says yes to creativity, yes to nourishment, yes to dissolution, yes to death, yes to grace, yes to withholding, yes to boundaries, yes to anger, yes to fear, yes to anxiety, yes to generosity, to love, to nurture, to courage. Just say yes, and you've stepped right in the middle of the auspicious principle, the Śrī principle. She is power, Shakti, and she is Śrī. She is also, the other simple way to understand Śrī, or power, in this case it's in her hair, it's represented in her hair, is to see it as having change and transformation associated with extra, missing, and broken, with more possibility. So Śrī invokes a world in which there is always a next, always a more. What's going to be the singular characteristic of Draupadi and all of the heroines of the Mahabharata? They will survive the war. Symbolically, they don't die at the end of the war. They endure the death. Draupadi endures the death of all of her children, who are murdered by the villainous Ashwatthama near the end of the Mahabharata. Imagine what she must endure, the horror. But because Śrī can't be eliminated, Śrī is always next, more, what is possible. She's the survivor in the story. Śrī survives any effort to extinguish or prevent or withhold. And Draupadi has that as part of her character. So she's dragged by her hair, by Dushasana, to the dice game because Yudhishthira lost her in the dice game as a stake in the game. Now you get the next feature of Śrī and the next feature of the goddess, which is that she's not just clever, she's wise, and she's smarter than everybody else in the room. And so she asks the room, did Yudhishthira lose me in the game before or after he lost himself? Well, he lost her after he lost himself, at which point he had no right to stake her. Now everyone in the room goes, oh, she has reclaimed power over herself, over her own destiny. And that's a feature of Draupadi, that women are abused and stolen their destiny, stolen their future, right? Because they're under these circumstances of societal expectation and cultural binding. Women are power, and they are abused, but they're tried. The masculine tries to contain feminine power. It never really works. That's what this story is about. But the feminine understands it must contain its own power. It binds itself. It binds itself because without boundaries and self-binding, there is no meaning. There can be no sacred unless there's difference. Hair unbound, hair bound, here and there, this and that, now and then, time, place, and identity, these all depend upon a relationship of difference, of meaning. Because you can't have meaning unless you have noticeable, valued difference. Well, she's wise, she's smart, clever, she's wise, she's understanding, and she knows the rules of the game. So when she finds out that Yudhishthira lost her in the game, and she's dragged to the dicing hall and threatened with rape. There's a famous scene where Duryodhana slaps his thigh, which is tantamount to saying, "You're next." Like, it's tantamount to her rape. And at that point, she raises she makes these observations, raises these objections, finds out Yudhishthira staked himself, that he has no right to her. And the elders in the room, who, by the way, have been complicit in this abuse, so there's no excuse for Bhishma and the others who are watching this humiliation of Draupadi and this degradation of the Shakti and this outright abuse of this wonderful, ingenious, brilliant woman right before their eyes. They have no excuse. They get no pass in this story. But they all say, okay, now you get 3 boons for the 3 days of this abuse, for the 3 which are marking the 3 days of her menses also. The first thing she says is, throw it all back to the status quo. Let's erase the dice game. Then let's erase the dice game, and then let's give the kingdom back to the Pandava, to the way it was. That is, status quo ante. That's all she asks for, right? And as for her third boon, she says, I will not keep it. Why? And she gives it back because she has no immediate use for it, because she knows that when you're given an advantage and it serves no purpose, all it can become is abuse. So instead of holding that third boon like ransom that she could use later to extort her own power, she doesn't do that. Why? First, because it's wrong. Second, because it would degrade her. How brilliant is that, right? Like, her auspiciousness says, I don't need your boon to be powerful. I don't need to extort you or ransom you or hold you hostage to a promise you made to me now, later. Because when later comes, I'm still me. I'm still the Shakti. I still know what auspiciousness is. So it would be inauspicious of her to hold on to the third boon that she doesn't intend to use. So she relinquishes it, which is emblematic of her wisdom, of her power, and of her own empowerment. Because if you can do it once, you can do it twice. And that's what she knows. So now the story goes on, and Yudhishthira takes them back to the game, and they play for one more throw, and they all end up in exile, because that's another part of where Mahabharata's twists and turns take us. And then Draupadi in exile becomes herself such an interesting topic, because she's going to be abducted again. Later on in the story, the Pandavas are out in what seems to be relatively safe territories, and they go out on a hunt, and they leave Draupadi in the village with like all the old Brahmins and all the other people in the entourage. And this king comes marching through and decides that he's going to abduct and rape Draupadi. And when the Pandavas, and she warns him, she says, don't do this. I have five very badass husbands, and but she doesn't resist. And the reason she doesn't resist is because it's another feature of the heroine, another feature of the Shakti, another feature of the auspiciousness of the feminine. She knows that in her dignity and in her self-empowerment, because she's telling the truth, it's going to be She has that advantage. Her advantage isn't that she's going to turn warrioress and beat up this king. Her advantage is she tells him the truth and he has to deal with that. Now, eventually, this guy is going to be caught up with, and what happens to him is another piece of the story. But the Shakti's power doesn't lie in violence. It lies in truth-telling. So she doesn't need to resort to violence. She needs to tell you what the account is, what the facts are, and then to say, you will be held accountable to the way things really are. I'm here to tell you that. And if you aren't willing to take up the responsibility to understand your vulnerability with respect to your possibilities and your freedom, you don't understand the nature of power. Because power has to do with, it's a powerful world, and accountability is what you need to learn.
Oh my gosh.
And that's the key to part of her genius, because she's always holding the world accountable and being empowered with truth. And truth is not a slippery category for her. Truth is, because remember, the goddess is also the natural world. The natural world has cycles. They can be like menstrual cycles. They're regular but not perfect. Like, they don't have to be perfect. They just have to be, they're just accountable. Does that make sense? So she's perfection with imperfection. She's accountability without stolidity. Like the same way, now I'm speaking out of turn here, but I don't think menstrual cycles usually happen on the same day every month, right? So at least in an ordinary woman's life, there's a certain window of now, then, right? So that too is kind of symbolically representative of how the Shakti's power and auspiciousness works, because the Shakti is not a theory of perfection. It's a theory of inclusion. It's a theory of responsible, accountable possibilities. It doesn't fall on every day. It falls on what's likely, what's possible. Why? Because the Shakti, the goddess, isn't about, her power isn't about absolutes. Her power is about giving you a sense of freedom, and then a sense of purpose, and then a sense of accountability in a world of possibilities. You're not in control. You don't know all the possibilities. You don't command. Well, she doesn't command you either. She says, here, this is what's possible. Now, what are you going to do? Now, she's also saying not everything is possible, because that would mean if everything were possible and you could give a full account, then everything would be controllable. That's not how it works. So on the one hand, she's saying this is how the world works. It's all been, in some sense, decided. Like, you will live, if you were born, you will die. And on the other hand, she's saying, now what do you want to do about that? You're not under her dictates. And even when the feminine is demonic, like the demonesses of Sanskrit lore, they seem to know better than the demons. The demons are always about certainty and absolute kind of dictatorial sovereignty. They resemble exactly what you think you're seeing in our own culture today, like toxic masculinity. When the feminine is toxic, it fails to account for itself. So demonesses don't take into consideration their own vulnerabilities, their own accountabilities. They think they can do anything because they're powerful. And they forget that they live in a world of possibilities, not of anything goes.
Sounds like they lose their
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, we can talk about that another time. Suparnika, there's a whole lore of demonesses that I'm really fascinated by. They turn up in Mahabharata, in Ramayana, elsewhere in proliferation. Hidimbi is not so much a demoness, but she married. So not all demonists. There's not a good and evil paradigm here. Well, I mentioned the demoness Hidimbi who marries Bhima and who births one of the great heroes of the Mahabharata, who is both hero and whose mother's a demon. So Hidimbi is another one of these kinds of interesting heroine characters because she doesn't submit so much as cooperate. And I think when we want to, and the reason I mentioned demonesses and heroines in the same breath is because the archetype of the feminine is not to dominate, it's to cooperate. And when demonesses go or miss, they don't cooperate with themselves. Does that make sense? Like they don't organize their own kind of relationship of life is conflicting, life is challenging, but you can't decide for it. Like you can't dominate it. So you have to figure out how to cooperate, like how to cut a deal. That's why heroines are always, they're deal cutters and offerers of grace. Those are the two things they do. By grace, they give without expectation of reward or expectation of meeting their own desires, which again becomes their own shadow, right? I mean, think of moms who give and give and give, but never think of themselves, right? Which can be terribly self-abusive. You count everybody but yourself. And so now the virtue has become your shadow. So they're repositories of giving. That's kind of their MO. The other side of it, though, is that they negotiate. Because sooner or later, you're going to have to make a deal. If you can't control the world, you're going to have a conversation with it, cooperate with it, and make a deal with it. Even if you don't particularly like the person you're dealing with, right? You have to make peace with your enemies because you can't extinguish them. That becomes moral atrocity. So there's all of those elements in the Shakti and all of those elements. And Draupadi is just such an exquisite example of, and because she's a mythic heroine, she can do what myth can do, which is take us to some boundary, like use exaggeration, like here's a woman with 5 husbands, right? Or use the very typical kind of, you asked about Hinduism at the very beginning, use a very Hindu way of viewing the world, which is fire and ice, right? Use the extremes to expand reality. So she can be very, very fiery and very pacific, very cool, very calm. Footnote, Buddhists understood that because they devised a middle way. A middle way wasn't a middle way, it was a rejection of extremes, which was an anti-Hindu view. Buddhists always thought the extremes were unreal and that's how you found the middle. The Hindus go, oh no, you want to find reality? Find the boundary. You want to find the heroic, feminine or masculine? Find it at the boundaries. You want to find the feminine? Find it at the boundaries and in the middle. You have to find the entirety of the project. That's why the Shakti is so, well, as the texts call it, vast, vyuha, immense. Because you have to find not only the boundaries, which are moving. Again, the boundaries aren't static. The boundaries are moving. So fire is getting hotter and ice is getting colder, which means the middle is getting bigger. Madhyama Vikasat, it says in the heart of recognition, expand the middle. Well, the middle expands when the boundaries expand. And Draupadi is a mistress of boundaries. That's what she knows how to do. She knows how to expand them, how to sustain them and grow the middle, and she knows how to contract them, how to hold fast, how to hold her ground. It's a fascinating issue. But I'll stop talking now, but I just want to say, really, follow the archetypes. Follow the deep symbolic resonance. That's where you'll find the goddess, the heroine. That's where you'll find Shaktism. You won't find it in doctrine. You won't find it in in specific characters. The specific characters will point you to these deeply emblematic and symbolic features of reality. And then look for them in embodiment, look for them in culture, look for them in nature.
Gosh, Douglas, so amazing. There's so
Sorry, I get going and then I can't stop. I am possessed by her, you know. I adore her as a mother. I cherish her as a sister. I want her as a lover. I mean, the goddess is my life.
It sure has been. And I am so grateful for this. I think I have just one last, maybe two questions. One is just as we're living in these times, how does she inspire you? I felt very inspired just listening to you about Shakti and how to have this, we are her, she is us, and she's more than us, and she is in the waters, and she is in nature, and how, of course we can go to that, we can revere that, it seems like water is going to, potentially become more and more of an issue.
Yeah, that's for sure.
So,
I would say take the three basic categories, like body, nature, and culture. In body, honor her. Revere the gift of your life. It was a gift. Give it auspiciousness. Nurture it. Honor it. She'll permit a certain amount of toxicity. You don't have to say no to every glass of wine, but but honor the gift of your own life and the gift it gives to others, because that's what she would do. Like, you take care of yourself, not just to take care of yourself, but to make the world better for everybody else, and especially the people you love. In these troubled times, I would say we need to honor nature more than ever, because we're destroying it. And I don't know if we will survive it. She will survive it. Humanity might not, but she will.
yeah, she's generative, right?
Well, humans may not survive because the dinosaurs didn't either, but she will. So create a conversation and a relationship, create a deeper sense of value and honor and cooperation with nature. Because if you don't cooperate with her and create a conversation, you're going to be on the wrong side of the argument. Last, I would say she stands for civilization. Like, how can we manage to live together? Because any effort to separate us and dishonor our differences, in every way in which we hurt and annihilate each other, in every way in which we dishonor the values of civilization, we again violate her very nature, which is to act collectively, to act cooperatively, to understand that conflict and challenge are real. We don't have to agree on everything. And I don't want to, because I can't learn unless there's, like, if we're all just in agreement, we're not going to get anywhere. Like, the goddess is in for some discomfort. It's like good learning. Like, it's going to change you. It's going to alter you. You might have to change your mind. You might have to give into your confirmation bias and understand what it is. You might have to, like, deal with yourself. And dealing with difference in civilization is going to be more important than ever, because we're living in a regime that wants to separate us, wants to polarize us. We're living in a regime that is overtly, shamelessly bigoted and racist and destructive, and wants to expedite the end of the world. I mean, it's their religious view. Like, they're waiting, they want the end times to come. Well, here they are, along with the end of civilization and the last best hope, which, dare I say, is democracy, which has always failed, except it's the best of the worst thing we've ever done. I mean, she is liberty standing in, holding the flame. And I believe that, because I think that what she represents there is not a language or an ethnicity or a religion. She stands for mother and decency, and in a certain sense, a relationship to each other that's based on consideration and boundaries, the law. She's that too. All of those things factor in, I think, in a practical way. But if we just, I mean, I'm really silly. I'm just a kid from New Jersey. And I often say to myself, like, what would my mom say? And I often say to myself, is when I talk to my daughters who are grown women and capable, lovely, empowered souls, like, what example do they offer to me? Not just that I'm offering to them. I should be an example for them. I should be the kind of father who regards and honors their autonomy, their empowerment, their dignity, their choices, who they love, what they want to do with their lives. I don't want to project my expectations on them. And so what do I have to learn from them? And we all go through that, I'm sure, as you're going through it too, as your children become adults. We move from their dependency, ultimately to a new relationship of friendship and of learning.
Yes.
And learning from them.
Absolutely.
And hopefully not too much dependence on them as we become less capable.
Yes.
Anyway, hey, thanks for the I did go on and on. It's my nature. You're always very forgiving to just let me roll.
I just want to hear your voice.
Well, that's very sweet of you.
Thank you so much for taking time for us to hear these stories again. They really are so meaningful, especially I feel like in these times you've been holding us. You've held us through the COVID times with the Mahabharata, and you're still offering these weekend sessions, correct?
Yeah. Well, thanks for mentioning. We are resuming Mahabharata. Mahabharata is vast and endless, and we're actually retelling the elemental story in the simplest way, kind of going through a particular 1,000-verse rendition of the 99,000-verse text. During COVID, we looked at the Book of the Forest in the original and read, I think, 30,000 lines of Sanskrit together. I'm doing the translating and the storytelling. And it's just so much fun. And so we do that every Sunday on Zoom. And then this fall, between September and December, we're going to have Monday evenings at 7. And we're going to do 7 sessions and this came from kind of, one of the things I really want to do is be responsive to these, very responsive and respectful of how long have we known each other, Jeannie? Like, how long have we been at this in this conversation? Like 20 years, at least 20 years. You're my friend, and you know so much. I want to be so respectful of you and what you've learned, and also of your curiosities. So last year we did a course in Buddhism because people were like, well, what's Buddhism about? Like, where did it come from? Like, how did it happen? We have all of that recorded. But we're going to do 7 Mondays on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Bardo Todal.
Oh, that's going to be fantastic. Yeah.
Well, it's a little indulgent. I studied Tibetan for many years. It's just another one of those odd things I can do. So I got to read the Tibetan Book of the Dead back into Tibetan because I was just curious. So like teaching it will give me an opportunity to kind of go and learn it again for myself, and then try to bring that into a conversation with people who don't have that particular familiarity or those particular set of skills. That's why you kind of keep me around a little bit, because I can help you through stuff like that. And then we're going to do another set of sessions on a form of Shiva called Kala Samhara Bhairava. So we're going to the ferocious yogic Shiva, who is an important player in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, but who is also a really important player in Shaktism and in the story of the universe and in these mythologies. And these mythologies and stories are ways of, exploring our unconscious, exploring our souls, but also trying to make connection to the real world. Like, what does this have to tell us about living and dying? What does this have to tell us about living with each other? So those will be Monday nights at 7. That's all easy to find. The media keeps moving around. So we have the old Facebook groups, but I now have the Rajanika Substack. Right. And Substack is an amazing platform because lots of really far more influential and important folks have emerged on Substack, like Heather Cox Richardson is there and Dan Rather is there. Substack has provided kind of a place for good conversation. And Rajanika Substack is there. It's free. It'll give you access. You'll get the newsletter. No obligations. Come when you like. You can drop in anytime.
And you can also sign up for those courses on your website?
Yeah, no, the website is not yet. The website is still being repaired. It's its own complication because can't really control it the way I want to. Like I can't really manage it the way I want to yet, but we're on the verge of it because there are literally dozens of these courses and thousands of hours. Like our recorded archive has 30, maybe 20,000 hours of recordings.
Wow.
Like, it's just insane because we've been at it for so long. And I mean, in the post-COVID era, we did 100+ lectures on the Bhagavad Gita. And there are folks there and they're asking questions and they're invested and they come, some hung in there for almost all of them. Some came and went and come when you want, drop in when you want. I try to make it accessible whenever it is you drop in. Like, that's cool. Yoga is always an invitation, never an obligation.
Thank you. Thank you so
much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And
thanks for being my friend for all these so very many things.
You are, as I've said to you so many times, just a teacher of mine, a friend of the heart. And I just so appreciate your voice. Your voice means so much to me. I hear you when I teach. And I take these stories to heart. They have meaning. They make me think. They make me question. So
well, now they're your stories. And tell them as you hear them. And as you hear yourself, and as one of the things I always say to yoga teachers or to any teacher is it's more important to speak from the authenticity, from the honesty, from the conviction of your own heart than it is to have sort of the encyclopedic data, and no more so than it is in this current age, because we're all just a click away from the information.
Yes.
So the teaching can't be about the information. Like AI or Google will find that for you in a heartbeat. Like you need the Eightfold Path, you need the 10 stages of Bodhisattva, you need the 27 forms of Bhairava. Bingo. Like click a button. But so it's not about the information, it's about the connection. Absolutely. And it's about the authenticity of the voice. And it's about how you've experienced it and can offer it from that place of honesty. And you have found that in your own voice. Like you are your own voice. And that's the greatest, like if I have any role in that, I'm honored and joyous, but it's not my voice, it's yours.
No, but you've brought things to me, and I appreciate that so very much.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Douglas.
Take care. Bye now.